7-year-old Sienna Blake didn't know that a glass of juice could carry so much weight. For her, this flight from Atlanta to London was a dream come true, a grand adventure with her father Ethan, who had promised to show her castles, clocks, and cobblestone streets. She wore her sparkly pink backpack, her tiny legs swinging excitedly from the edge of the leather seat in 3A. Her eyes sparkled with wonder, peeking out the window at the jet engine and fluffy clouds. She was blissfully unaware of the lesson the world was about to teach her, that even in first class, even with a smile, some people will try to remind you that you don't belong. Sitting next to her in 3B was her father, Ethan Blake. At 44, he carried the quiet gravity of a man who had earned his position not by demanding attention, but by commanding respect. Tall, sharply dressed in a navy suit softened by a cashmere pullover, Ethan was more than just a successful executive. He was the newly appointed CEO of Orion Aviation Group, the parent company that owned the very airline they were flying. But he hadn't told anyone on board. He didn't wear his title like armor. He preferred to let people reveal themselves for better or worse. And that's exactly what happened. The flight attendant's name was Susan. She had worked the first-class cabin for years. Her smile was sharp, her tone clipped with the precision of someone used to control. She had just finished offering a glass of champagne to a couple in row 2 when she turned to Sienna and said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "We don't usually serve juice boxes in first class, sweetheart." She smiled as if she were offering helpful advice, but Ethan heard the undertone. So did Sienna. He tried to remain calm. "Sparkling water with lime for both of us," he said evenly. Susan's face tightened. "Children usually prefer juice," she said, as if correcting him. But she complied, returning minutes later with a glass of sparkling water and a thinly veiled warning. "Hold it carefully," she told Sienna. "These seats are leather. They stain." When Sienna reached for the glass, Susan subtly pulled it back just enough to cause a minor spill. Water splashed onto Sienna's backpack. Her eyes widened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan leaned forward, voice low and composed. "That's enough." "You pulled the glass away. My daughter did nothing wrong," Susan huffed, retreating without apology. Ethan felt a familiar, bitter chill. He'd experienced it his entire life, the kind of condescension that wears a uniform and hides behind policy. But this time it wasn't just about him. It was about Sienna. And as he looked down at his daughter trying not to cry, he knew this flight was no longer just a trip. It was a moment that could shape her forever. Still, he didn't escalate. He didn't shout. He focused on Sienna, comforting her, distracting her with coloring books, and putting on her favorite movie. But the tension didn't end. During meal service, Susan questioned whether Sienna could handle pasta with cream sauce. Later, she caused a salt shaker to tip over and blamed Sienna for the mess. Each action on its own might seem small, but taken together, it painted a cruel pattern, an adult deliberately undermining a child for no other reason than prejudice. Ethan remained calm, but his patience thinned. He requested that Susan no longer serve them and asked for another attendant instead. Maria, the new flight attendant, treated Sienna with warmth and care, offering her ice cream, chatting about cartoons, and simply showing her the kindness she deserved. For a while, things felt normal again, but Ethan noticed Susan whispering with the captain. Something was brewing, and then it happened. As the plane touched down in London, a strange announcement came over the intercom. All passengers were to remain seated. Police would be boarding the aircraft. Confused murmurs filled the cabin. Ethan felt his heart sink. When the door opened, 2 officers stepped aboard. Susan pointed to Ethan and said, "That's him. Row 3. He's been threatening me and his child." Sienna clung to her father, terrified. Ethan stood calm and composed. He gathered their things, then handed the station manager a business card. It simply read, "Ethan Blake, Chief Executive Officer, Orion Aviation Group." In that instant, the energy on the plane flipped. The very people who judged him now looked at him with shock and fear. Susan's power collapsed, and justice, true undeniable justice, began its course. This wasn't just about juice. It was about dignity. And what Ethan did next would shake an entire industry. The silence on the jet bridge was crushing. Just moments ago, Ethan Blake had been treated like a threat, interrogated by uniformed officers, stared down by passengers, and vilified by a woman who mistook her prejudice for professionalism. But now as he calmly handed over his business card to the airline station manager, the dynamic shattered. Ethan Blake, Chief Executive Officer, Orion Aviation Group. The words landed like a bomb. David Langston, the station manager, paled. His hand trembled as he reread the title on the high-quality cardstock. His jaw slackened, his breath caught. This wasn't just a passenger. This was the man whose name had been printed on corporate memos, whose vision was being pitched across boardrooms in 3 continents. And Langston had just allowed him to be escorted off a flight by the police based on the unverified word of a flight attendant. A beat passed. The officers stood frozen, their posture rigid but confused. They weren't trained for this. There was no handbook entry on what to do when the guy you're detaining turns out to be your boss's boss. Susan, however, was still caught in her own illusion of power. "I told you he was becoming aggressive." She snapped, her voice sharp with defensive energy. He was intimidating, and his daughter was out of control. Her tone, once commanding, now rang hollow. It bounced against the silence, echoing back at her like a bad lie in a courtroom. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at her. No anger, no gloating, just pure surgical clarity. "You saw a black man in first class," he said quietly, and assumed the worst. Susan opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her authority, so carefully curated over decades of seniority, had evaporated. Her pinched expression twisted into something almost childlike, the dawning horror of a person who realizes they may have just ended their own career. The silence broke with the arrival of Robert Vega, the airline's senior vice president of international operations. He had rushed to the gate expecting to greet the new CEO with a corporate welcome team and a red carpet protocol. Instead, he found chaos police officers, a crying child, and a visibly rattled flight crew. "Ethan, me God, what happened?" Robert asked, his voice coated in alarm. "There was a failure," Ethan said evenly, "at every level." Vega turned to Langston, who stammered, "We didn't know. She called the authorities. She said there was a threat." "She was the threat," Ethan cut in. "Not to me, but to your brand, to your values, to the very idea that flying with us means something better." Then he turned to the officers. His tone was measured but firm. "I will, of course, cooperate with any questions, but you'll do it through my legal team, and you'll be hearing from our board. What happened on that aircraft wasn't just an incident, it was a violation." Constable Morton, the older officer, shifted uneasily. "Sir, we were just responding to the call made from the aircraft." Ethan's eyes were steady, without verification, without speaking to any other passengers, without pause. He gestured back toward the cabin where Mrs. Elkins, the woman from row 4, was now standing in the aisle, visibly upset. "I saw everything she said loud enough for everyone to hear. That flight attendant harassed them from takeoff to landing. That child did nothing wrong, neither did her father." Morton nodded, slightly discomfort rippling through his posture. "Well, be documenting this carefully, sir." "I suggest you do," Ethan replied. Within 30 minutes, Susan was suspended on the spot. Her badge and credentials were taken from her in front of the police and airline staff. She tried to protest, claiming that she'd been trying to maintain order and follow protocol, but no one was listening anymore. The higher-ups weren't interested in hearing excuses. They had a public relations disaster on their hands, and they knew it. By the time Ethan and Sienna reached the VIP lounge, word had already spread. The video, quietly filmed by a passenger in business class, had been posted to Twitter with the caption, "Flight attendant calls cops on black CEO, and his daughter gets the shock of her life on the jet bridge." It exploded. Within 6 hours, it had over 5 million views. Within 12, it made national headlines. CNN, NBC, the New York Times. Even international outlets like BBC and Al Jazeera picked it up. People weren't just angry, they were ignited. Corporate America has long walked the tightrope between public image and internal culture. But this story struck something deeper. It wasn't about a viral moment, it was about an everyday cruelty that had finally been caught in the act. At a press conference 2 days later, Ethan stepped onto the podium not as a victim, but as a leader. He didn't use the moment to vent. He used it to rebuild. "I'm not here to talk about punishment," he said. "I'm here to talk about structure. Because what happened to me and my daughter happens to people without titles every single day. I just had the privilege to fight back. They don't, He then introduced something bold, the Sienna Foundation. Named after his daughter, the foundation had two missions: fund scholarships for underrepresented youth in aviation logistics and executive leadership. Design and implement anti-bias training across airline staff and law enforcement using Flight 0197 as a case study. But this wasn't performative. It was personal. Ethan committed $1 million of his own stock equity into the foundation alongside a matching grant from Orion Aviation's board. The foundation would begin its first pilot program within 90 days, starting with Delta's transatlantic staff and expanding across all North American partners by year-end. Meanwhile, the fallout continued for Susan. Her name was revealed. Her history, too. An internal audit showed she had received 17 prior complaints over a 5-year span, 11 of which cited discriminatory behavior toward passengers of color. She had been protected by tenure union policies and a culture that quietly excused difficult but experienced staff. Not anymore. She lost her pension, her industry standing, her friends. By the end of the week, she was a national symbol of systemic failure, not because she made a mistake, but because she thought she was above accountability. And now, everywhere she went, people recognized her, not for her service, but for her fall. But the story for Ethan and Sienna wasn't about revenge. In a quiet moment, days after the press firestorm, Ethan sat with Sienna by a window overlooking the River Thames. She was coloring: dragons, castles, clouds. Her world had shifted, but not broken. "Daddy," she said softly, "did we win?" Ethan smiled, his heart still heavy, but full of something brighter. "We didn't just win, baby girl," he said, brushing a curl behind her ear. "We changed the rules. The world didn't just watch the video. It studied it. In less than 72 hours, the footage of Flight 0197 became more than viral. It became required viewing. In corporate offices and law schools and social media, think tanks and DEI training rooms, the video of Ethan Blake calmly standing up to injustice, while holding his daughter's hand, was played on loop. His silence before the reveal, his restraint, the moment he handed over his business card, and then the look on Susan's face as her world unraveled in real time. People weren't just outraged. They were obsessed. It wasn't just the drama. It was the symbolism. A little black girl being shamed for drinking sparkling water in first class. A father, quietly powerful, being treated like a threat. A uniformed woman, so sure of her own righteousness, crashing into her own prejudice. In a country still wrestling with the legacy of race power in presentation, the story struck a nerve, especially for older Americans who had seen progress, but also witnessed the ways power could still be used to humiliate, quietly, systemically, and with a smile. The media couldn't get enough. 60 Minutes reached out for an exclusive. The New York Times ran a front-page editorial, "Legacy Not" title, "How Ethan Blake Changed the Narrative at 35,000 Feet." PBS hosted a town hall, "Belonging in America: What First Class Revealed About Us." But Ethan refused the spotlight. He turned down interviews. He declined profiles. His response was strategic and surgical, just like how he ran companies. He wasn't building a brand. He was building infrastructure for change. The first priority, getting the Sienna Foundation operational. At Orion Aviation's global headquarters in Atlanta, the mood was a mix of urgency and accountability. Ethan, true to form, didn't scream or demand heads roll. He convened his leadership team in the glass-walled conference room on the 29th floor and calmly placed a stack of passenger complaints on the table, most of them referencing Susan over the past 5 years. Then he slid over a folder marked Initiative 1. Inside was a comprehensive rollout plan: Phase 1 launch, Sienna Foundation's training curriculum in 5 pilot airports: Atlanta, JFK, Heathrow, LAX, and O'Hare. Phase 2, partner with local police departments stationed at each airport for cross-training and de-escalation and anti-bias protocols. Phase 3, provide anonymous reporting systems for passengers and crew to report discriminatory behavior in real time. The board approved it unanimously. No debate, no foot dragging. They had seen the video. They knew what was at stake. But Ethan wasn't finished. He ordered a full internal audit of all frontline employees across Orion subsidiaries, flagging any crew members with 3 or more unresolved complaints regardless of rank or tenure. If a manager had failed to act on any of them, they would be investigated as well. It sent a chill through middle management, but for the first time, it was the right kind of fear. The kind that doesn't come from a threat, but from the realization that someone in charge finally cares enough to change everything. Meanwhile, the Siena Foundation officially launched its first partnership with Howard University School of Aviation and Public Policy. It funded 25 full-ride scholarships for underrepresented students, pursuing careers in flight operations, aerospace engineering, aviation law, and airline leadership. The scholarships were named after real individuals whose lives had been shaped or shattered by incidents like Flight 197. Each scholarship was tied to mentorship. Each recipient was required to complete anti-bias training modules and contribute to fieldwork at participating airports. The idea wasn't just to get them into positions of power, it was to equip them to lead with empathy once they arrived. The media barely covered it. No shouting, no outrage, no twist. But Ethan didn't care. This isn't for attention, he told his team. This is for momentum. Inside the industry, however, the ripple effects were seismic. Other major airlines, United American Emirates, even Qantas, began reviewing their own flight crew conduct records. Internal memos were leaked showing a surge in emergency meetings about bias training, crisis communication, and customer protocol updates. One executive at a rival airline who asked to remain anonymous told Bloomberg, "What happened to Delta could have happened to any of us. We just got lucky the CEO wasn't on board." But Ethan wasn't motivated by fear. He was motivated by legacy. In one of the few internal memos he allowed to go public, he wrote, "The goal is not to punish one woman. The goal is to build an airline and a world where my daughter doesn't have to wonder if she belongs. If we can make her seat feel safe, we can make any seat feel safe." The quote was reprinted everywhere, in classrooms, on protest signs, on the wall of Orion's training center in Chicago. And then came the letter. A handwritten envelope arrived at Orion's headquarters from a woman in Nebraska. Inside was a single page in careful script. "Dear Mr. Blake, I'm 84 years old. I grew up in Alabama. I rode in the back of the bus. I saw things I hope my great-grandkids never do. But when I watched what you did for your daughter on that plane, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because you gave me hope. Keep going. Please keep going. Mrs. Bernice Lawson." Ethan kept the letter, framed it, hung it beside a photo of Siena coloring on that flight, the moment he reminded the world that integrity travels further than any aircraft ever could. Meanwhile, Susan's name slowly disappeared from the headlines. She had been fired, her pension revoked, her flight benefits dissolved. But the real sentence was social. She became a pariah. Her suburban life collapsed inwards. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her friends, blocked her on Facebook, and her children were pulled into the online fallout. She issued a public apology, but it rang hollow, overshadowed by the video clips and comment threads that refused to forget. Her downfall wasn't just swift, it was complete, and still Ethan never spoke her name again. The final piece of the puzzle came from Siena herself. 1 month after the incident, she stood beside her father on the stage at the Foundation's inaugural gala in Washington, D.C. The ballroom was packed with donors, allies, and airline partners from around the world. Siena wore a powder blue dress and matching sneakers. She held her father's hand, smiling shyly at the crowd. When asked if she wanted to say something, she paused, then leaned toward the mic and said in her small but steady voice, "Next time someone says I don't belong somewhere, they'll know they're wrong." The room stood still and then erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was release. It was gratitude. It was generational vindication. For Ethan, it was the moment he knew this had never been just about a flight. It was about altitude, about lifting others, about reminding a fractured world that sometimes the smallest passenger carries the most powerful lesson. By the end of the second month, the Siena Foundation had already trained over 3,000 airline staff across the United States and the UK. Its pilot curriculum, designed in collaboration with sociologists, behavioral scientists, and trauma psychologists, was no longer just a corporate response. It was a movement with measurable outcomes. Airports began rolling out designated equity response units teams specifically trained to de-escalate racially charged incidents before law enforcement needed to be involved. Video kiosks were installed at gates for anonymous passenger reporting. More importantly, people were using them, not to get anyone fired, but to document patterns, to be heard. And suddenly being seen wasn't a privilege, it was policy. Ethan Blake watched this unfold from both the command center and the shadows. He never asked to be a symbol. He had never craved the spotlight. He was a builder by trade, a logistics executive, a planner. But life, as it often does, didn't ask for permission. It simply handed him the responsibility and the microphone. And now the whole world was listening. On Capitol Hill, the ripple effect arrived like thunder. A bipartisan coalition in the Senate introduced the Flight Passengers Civil Protection Act, a bill aimed at mandating implicit bias and de-escalation training for all commercial airline personnel operating in or out of U.S. airspace. It included safeguards for passengers, especially children, against retaliatory reporting by flight crew members, and created a public-facing airline incident registry. The bill referenced the Sienna Blake incident 5 separate times. During the opening committee hearing, a congressman from Vermont held up a framed still image Ethan holding Sienna's hand as they were led down the jet bridge. He looked up at the panel and said, "This is what leadership looks like. Not from a podium, not in a boardroom, but on a plane under pressure when a little girl's future was on the line." Back at Orion Aviation's headquarters, Ethan watched the hearing from his office. He didn't cry, but for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of pause, a crack in the wall. He turned away from the screen and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. There was something poetic about it. The city that had once been the cradle of civil rights now bore witness to a new kind of reckoning, this time from 35,000 feet in the air. The attention didn't stop. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture reached out asking to include the now iconic Flight 7 video, and the Sienna Foundation launched documents in their Contemporary Justice exhibit. The curators saw it as a modern chapter of a much longer story, one that began with marches and boycotts, and now included iPhones, aircraft cabins, and 7-year-old girls in sparkling sneakers. Ethan was deeply moved, but also exhausted, because while the world celebrated his strength, they didn't see the weight. Everywhere he went, people shook his hand, stopped him in grocery stores, whispered thank you in elevators. His email inbox had thousands of unread messages. Parents shared stories of their own children being humiliated, ignored, or silenced. Executives offered donations. Universities offered honorary degrees. Documentary producers offered rights. But all Ethan really wanted was peace for his daughter. Sienna, for her part, was coping better than most adults expected. Children are resilient, yes, but they're also porous. They absorb the emotions of the adults around them. And Ethan, despite his strength, carried tension like a silent storm cloud. Sienna could feel it even as she returned to school, even as the kids whispered about her being on the news. One day after ballet class, she asked him, "Daddy, when are we going to fly again?" Ethan hesitated. The question hit harder than he expected. "Why do you ask, little star?" he replied, gently tying her shoe. "Because I don't want people looking at me like that again, not even the nice ones." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He smiled softly and kissed her forehead. But inside, the guilt was enormous. For all the systems he was changing, for all the boardrooms he'd challenged and laws he'd helped shape, he couldn't undo the one thing that hurt most, her loss of innocence. He realized something then. This wasn't just about impact. It was about insulation, about protecting his daughter from being devoured by the very cause built in her name. He made a decision that week. He assigned a proxy CEO for 6 months there, a trusted operations lead named Marissa Young, who had worked under him for a decade. He would step back from day-to-day management, focusing solely on the Sienna Foundation strategy while spending quality time with his daughter. He bought a house on the edge of Lake Oconee, peaceful, no media, no pressure. For the first time in 2 months, Ethan stopped checking his phone every 10 minutes. He taught Sienna how to fish. They built a Lego city. She named the largest building, "No mean people allowed." He laughed, she healed, and so did he. Meanwhile, back in the public square, the conversation took on a life of its own. On TikTok, teenagers reenacted Susan's downfall in comedic skits. On Reddit, a 1,000 comment thread debated whether Ethan's calm response was too polite or strategically genius. On LinkedIn, CEOs wrote long-form posts about how the story made them rethink leadership and inclusion. One unexpected voice came from a retired United Airlines purser who wrote a viral op-ed in USA Today titled, "I was Susan, and I was wrong." In it, she admitted to similar biases throughout her career. She described how easy it was to use professionalism as a mask for control, and how seeing the video shattered her illusion that she'd always been neutral. Her final paragraph read, "It took seeing myself in someone else's mistake to realize it spent 30 years reinforcing systems I claimed to rise above." Mr. Blake didn't just defend his daughter, he held up a mirror to all of us. I finally saw my reflection. And I didn't like it. The piece was shared over 8 million times. By month 4, the Siena Foundation had expanded into 6 countries. Airports in Canada, the Netherlands, South Africa, and Japan joined the training program. Ethan worked with ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, to pilot the first global anti-bias audit across major international routes. It was no longer a U.S. incident. It had become a global blueprint. And in the middle of it all, one quiet little girl went back to school and didn't say a word about any of it. Not because she was ashamed, but because for the first time in months, no one asked. And that silence was sacred. Then came the award, the Presidential Medal of Citizens Honor Roll of the nation's highest civilian awards for moral courage and service. The White House issued the invite in late November. The ceremony would be held in December. Ethan declined politely but firmly. He didn't need a medal. He had a daughter who slept peacefully again. But he did record a message to be played in his absence. It was just 2 minutes long. No teleprompter, no flash. He stood in front of a plain wall, wore a simple sweater, and looked directly into the lens. If you're watching this, it means you believe in dignity, not just as an idea, but as a standard. I didn't stop that flight because I had a title. I stopped it because I had a daughter. You don't need to be a CEO to demand fairness. You don't need 1 million followers to call out harm. You just need to believe that the seat you're sitting in is yours. And if someone tries to take that away from you, stand. But stand with truth, with calm, with clarity. That's what my daughter taught me. That's what I hope this story teaches the next. The room went silent, and then standing ovation. In the end, Ethan Blake never wrote a memoir. He never signed a book deal, never took the TED stage, never monetized the moment. But he left behind something far more lasting, a foundation that outlived the headline. A daughter who laughed again, and a quiet truth passed from father to child to the world. Justice doesn't wear a badge. It walks beside you quietly until it's time to speak. The lake house had served its purpose. For 6 months, Ethan Blake withdrew from the stage of global business, choosing instead to pour his time into quiet mornings, with Sienna hikes through pine forests and uninterrupted dinners, where her laughter filled the room instead of his phone notifications. The CEO, who once commanded billion-dollar boardrooms, was now an expert at braiding hair, reading bedtime stories, and building tree forts. And Sienna, she was sleeping through the night again. The dark weight behind her eyes had lifted, but the world wasn't waiting. Back at Orion Aviation Group, Marissa Yang had done a stellar job as interim CEO. Under her steady hand, the company's public image not only recovered, it flourished. Flight bookings rose 18% in Q2. Employee satisfaction climbed for the first time in 3 years. And the Siena Foundation had blossomed into a force of its own. But more than growth, there was gravity. The foundation had shifted from a reactive nonprofit into a strategic partner for change, operating in 14 countries across North America, Europe, and Asia. Its signature Flight Forward curriculum was now endorsed by both ICAO and IATA and had been adopted in 23 major airports. By month 7, Ethan knew it was time to return. His re-entry was quiet but deliberate. On his first day back at Orion's headquarters in Atlanta, there was no press conference, no champagne, just a brown suit, a navy blue tie, and a floor-to-ceiling whiteboard already filled with tasks. He didn't want applause. He wanted architecture strategic systems that would outlive him. He began with a new division, Orion Global Human Insight, think tank embedded inside the company, dedicated to human-centered data passenger, empathy analytics, and real-time feedback loops for customer experience rooted in equity. It wasn't a PR move. It was a core business function funded like any other arm of the enterprise. He promoted Marissa to president of global strategy, ensuring her voice would be central going forward. He reorganized their executive training program to include cultural fluency modules and required every C-suite officer, himself included, to complete an intensive bias accountability audit. But most impactful, he restructured the complaint review pipeline. Every passenger feedback report involving possible discrimination would now pass through a triage board composed not just of executives, but of rotating customer representatives, crew advocates, and DEI experts from the Siena Foundation. No more complaint black holes, Ethan said in one meeting. Every voice lands somewhere. But as his influence deepened within corporate strategy, his attention stayed split because the Siena Foundation was evolving faster than anyone expected. In Tokyo, a pilot program launched with Haneda Airport, training 200 workers in cross-cultural empathy and bilingual de-escalation. In Cape Town, a partnership with the University of the Western Cape funded a class of 30 aviation law scholars from disadvantaged backgrounds. In Amsterdam, a historic agreement was signed with Schiphol International, a long-term pledge to integrate the Siena Protocol into every onboarding training, marking the first time a European airport agreed to permanently embed a U.S.-born ethics initiative into its governance charter. At the United Nations, a representative from the foundation was invited to speak on a panel titled "Silent Systems When Bias Goes Unchecked in Transit." The impact was undeniable. But the moment that mattered most, it came on a rainy Thursday afternoon during the Global Youth Leadership Forum in Geneva. Sienna Blake had never given a speech, not a real one, but at 10 years old, she had been invited as a special guest voice by the forum's executive board. They said it was symbolic in acknowledgement of the story that started it all. Ethan had hesitated at first. He didn't want to push her into the spotlight again, but Sienna had made the choice herself. "I want to say something this time," she told him. "My way." They rehearsed, but not too much. Ethan didn't want to mold her into a talking point. He wanted her to speak from the place where truth lives, in the belly of lived experience softened by time, but not erased. And so on that gray afternoon in Geneva, Sienna stepped onto the stage in a seafoam green dress and silver flats. Her curly hair was pulled back with a headband. She stood behind the podium, looked out over the crowd of world leaders, students, educators, and reporters, and said, "Hi, my name is Sienna Blake. I'm not a lawyer, or a pilot, or a CEO. I'm just a girl who wanted to drink water in first class without being told I didn't belong. That's it. That's how this started. I was scared. I cried. I thought I did something wrong, but my dad told me I didn't. He told me sometimes people see what they want to see, and sometimes they don't see you at all. That hurt, but it helped too, because now I see people. I see when someone's quiet, when someone's scared, when someone's sitting alone. I try to be the person who sees them. If you remember one thing, I hope it's this: just because someone doesn't look like they belong doesn't mean they don't. Sometimes they belong more than anyone else in the room." There was no dramatic music, no spotlights, just tears, nods, applause. And in that moment, Sienna didn't just reclaim her story, she rewrote the ending. Ethan watched from backstage, hand pressed to his chest, not from fear, not even pride, but from awe. He had seen empires rise, entire logistics networks built from scratch. He had closed billion-dollar deals and met heads of state, but nothing compared to this. A 10-year-old girl once silenced by power, now giving it away freely. The ripple effects were instant. The Geneva Forum released a youth engagement statement the following day, calling for the creation of a permanent Global Youth Observers Council, with Sienna Blake named as its inaugural honorary advisor. Within weeks, youth-led versions of the Siena Foundation began springing up in community centers across Detroit, Glasgow, Nairobi, and Sao Paulo. They weren't just about travel. They were about belonging in schools and parks, on buses and hospitals. The Foundation's mission had grown beyond airspace. It had landed. Back in Atlanta, Ethan began laying the groundwork for Phase 2 of the Foundation's global mission, STP, Systemic Training for Equity in Public Spaces. The idea was simple. What if the empathy training developed for air travel could be adapted for schools, emergency rooms, public transportation, even housing authorities? The beta version launched in Boston, targeting 3 areas: public libraries, community policing units, DMV frontline staff. Within 60 days, measurable changes were reported: a 42% drop in public complaints, a 28% increase in positive staff evaluations, a 63% improvement in feeling heard metrics in customer exit surveys. The results were staggering. By now, Forbes, Fast Company, and the Wall Street Journal were all calling The Siena Foundation, one of the most effective civil society accelerators of the decade. But Ethan didn't flinch. This isn't a tech startup, he told his staff. This is a human project. We don't measure value by growth, we measure it by gentleness. One evening after a long day at headquarters, Ethan picked up Sienna from art club. She handed him a sketch of a plane flying above a mountain range. Inside the plane window, two small figures were visible, a girl with curls and a man in a suit. But above them was written a single line. This time no one looked at us funny. He folded the picture carefully. No speech had ever hit harder. By the end of the year, the Siena Foundation had reached over 60 airports, 400 schools, and was working with 3 national governments on equity-centered public space design. Ethan was nominated for the Carnegie Medal for Public Service. He declined the ceremony, but sent Sienna in his place. She accepted it smiling, confident, and unapologetically radiant. The legacy wasn't his anymore. It was theirs. And perhaps that's what real leadership is. Not building kingdoms, not toppling villains, but lifting the next voice higher until you're no longer needed. And when that moment comes, if you've done it right, the silence left behind feels just like peace. It started with the walls. Inside Orion Aviation Group's Atlanta headquarters, the towering glass panels and minimalist steel beams remained untouched, but the mood had changed. Gone were the polished motivational posters and brand slogans framed in cold acrylic. In their place now hung framed letters from passengers' drawings from school children, and one particular watercolor from Sienna Blake, a plane flying above a rainbow with the words, "We see everyone now." It was more than decor. It was a declaration. Over the past year, Orion had transformed not by rebranding itself, but by rebuilding itself from the inside out. The Siena Foundation's influence had permeated far beyond training modules and airport terminals. It had become a cultural compass for how the company thought, hired, communicated, and evolved. Every onboarding program now began with a belonging in transit segmenta, reflective session facilitated not by HR, but by former passengers who had experienced both kindness and bias in flight. Pilots, gate agents, and corporate staff sat together not to recite policy, but to listen, to understand. Every leadership meeting opened with a single question: what would a traveler in crisis need from us today? That shift from efficiency to empathy didn't slow the company down. It propelled it forward. Customer retention hit an all-time high. Complaint resolution time was reduced by 40%. And in annual reviews, employees cited emotional safety as the #1 reason they stayed. But none of that was on a billboard. None of it came with a hashtag. It was just the result of a simple, powerful idea: every seat holds a story. In the center of it all, Ethan Blake remained steady. He had returned to his CEO post not with grand speeches or sweeping decrees, but with a quiet consistency. His presence was calm, his demands intentional. He walked the terminals in casual clothes, sat with junior flight crews in break rooms, asked the cleaners what their shift looked like. And when he entered the corporate elevator, he pressed the closed door button, but never the one marked executive floor. To him, leadership had become less about vision and more about tone. The tone you set when no one is watching, the tone that guides the room after you leave. And yet he could feel it coming. The inevitable question: what comes next? Sienna was growing up. At 11, she was taller, wiser, quieter in some ways, bolder in others. Her school had recently asked her to give a talk about the Siena Foundation, and while she accepted, she surprised everyone, including Ethan B., choosing not to speak about what happened on Flight Roma 97. Instead, she told a story about a girl in her class who always ate lunch alone, about how she sat with her one day, not out of pity, but because she looked like she had good stories. They became friends. When asked what this had to do with her foundation, she said, "Because that's what we do. We make the quiet ones feel seen again." The audience clapped. Ethan, watching from the back row, felt his heart contract, not from pride, but from the realization that his daughter had surpassed him in the very thing he'd set out to build: a voice that didn't need force to be heard. At Orion, succession planning had quietly begun. Not because Ethan was tired, but because he understood something most leaders ignored. True legacy isn't immortal, it's intentional. It knows when to step back. He called Marissa Yang into his office one morning, pouring her a cup of jasmine tea. a habit they had kept since her first day as interim CEO during his sabbatical. "I need you to start preparing," he said. For what she asked? For the next chapter. One where I'm not in this seat anymore. She paused. "Are you stepping down?" "Eventually," he said, "but not with a press release, not with headlines. You'll just step back and let the air fill in around me. If we've done this right, no one should feel the shift." She looked at him carefully. "You sure?" He nodded. "I want to stop being the reason people listen and start being the reason they lead." In the following months, Ethan gradually delegated his remaining roles. He sat on fewer calls, let junior VPs run quarterly reviews. He spent more time at foundation campuses, visiting youth programs and innovation labs in person. He mentored from the background, showed up unannounced, asked hard questions gently. He didn't need the title. He had effect. An effect, unlike position, didn't need a nameplate. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. During a foundation summit in Seattle, Ethan was approached by a teenage girl from Nairobi who had just completed her first year in aviation law. She showed him her badge, her internship letter, and then handed him a folded note. Inside were 5 words. "Tell your daughter thank you." Ethan couldn't speak. He simply nodded, eyes wet. That night, sitting in his hotel room with the lights low, he wrote the final memo of his Orion career. It wasn't addressed to the board or the shareholders. It was to his employees, his flight crew, as he often called them. Internal memo, subject: clarity at cruising altitude, from Ethan Blake. "To the people who helped build the sky with me. Thank you. Thank you for walking through change with steady feet, for choosing empathy when it was easier to retreat, for turning a story into a standard. When my daughter cried in 3A, none of you were there. But now you're everywhere. In the way we greet a nervous flyer, in the way we train each new hire, in the space we've created, not just in the cabin, but in our culture. My role is evolving. I will be stepping back from daily operations to allow this company to soar on its own terms. You know what to do. You've known for a while. And I'll be here, not at the helm, but at the edge of the field, watching the sky. Gratefully, Ethan." No press release was issued. No media alerts. Just a quiet announcement during an internal town hall where Ethan shook hands, offered hugs, and walked out of the auditorium to the sound of sustained applause. Outside, Sienna was waiting with a drawing of a hot air balloon. "This one's for you," she said. "What's it called?" Ethan asked. She grinned. "The Quiet Exit." He smiled. "Perfect." From that point on, Ethan became chair emeritus. Quiet advisor and ambassador, rarely seen at the front, but always felt in the air. He focused his time fully on the Sienna Foundation, now operating in 29 countries, and launched the Children of Flight Initiative, a global storytelling program where young people shared experiences of exclusion, kindness, and resilience in public spaces. Sienna helped lead the youth editorial board. She began mentoring other kids, many of whom had been silenced in classrooms, dismissed in stores, or laughed at for not looking like they belonged. And she told them simply, "You do," even if they don't know it yet. By the following spring, Orion's new CEO gave their first address. Marissa Yang stood tall behind the podium, not in Ethan's shadow, but in her own light. She credited the past but focused on the future. And in her closing line, she echoed something familiar. "Every seat holds a story, and today we fly forward together." The crowd stood. In the back of the room, Ethan didn't. He simply smiled, then slipped out the side door. The sky, after all, didn't need him to rise. It already had. It didn't end on a stage. It ended on a bench under a cherry tree beside a quiet river in Kyoto. Ethan Blake sat beside his daughter, now 12, watching cherry blossoms drift lazily in the breeze. They had spent the morning visiting a small airfield museum where a local guide recognized Sienna not from a headline, but from a children's book recently published by the Sienna Foundation, Wings Without Permission. The moment felt complete, unscripted, unforced. Exactly how Ethan had hoped the story would close. Sienna leaned into his shoulder, sipping tea. "Daddy," she said, "do you think people will forget?" He glanced at her. "Forget what? Me. Us. That flight." Ethan smiled softly. "Maybe. Someday. But I think that's okay." Why? Because it means the world got better and didn't need to remember the pain to keep doing the right thing. Sienna nodded, quiet for a moment. "Then so does that mean the story's over?" Ethan thought about that. No, he said. I think it just means you get to start writing your own. And she did. Later that year, Sienna gave a closing speech at the first ever Youth Summit on Human Dignity in Public Spaces, held in Geneva, continuation of the very conference where she had once stood as a nervous 10-year-old girl. Now she walked confidently to the podium, no script, no notes. You know, she began when I was 7, someone decided I didn't belong in first class. But the real problem wasn't the seat, it was the silence around it. That silence, that moment when people see something wrong but say nothing, that's what gives injustice a place to sit. My dad used his voice, but not to shout. He used it to make space. And now I want to use mine to fill it. There were no grand promises, just a calm, honest truth, one that resonated more deeply than any statistic. Because Sienna didn't speak like a child anymore. She spoke like a bridge. At home, things remained beautifully ordinary. Ethan spent most days in the background, advising, mentoring, tending a small garden behind their Atlanta townhouse. He taught ethics part-time at Spelman College, guest lectured on quiet leadership at Yale, and visited the Sienna Foundation campuses with the proud gaze of a father who knew when to let go. He never wrote a book, never accepted a documentary deal, never gave the exclusive. Instead, he created something better, a foundation that outlasted the news cycle. A daughter who led with empathy, not ego. A world just a little softer than the one he grew up in. One day, a reporter finally caught up with him at a charity event. He asked Mr. Blake if you could summarize everything this journey has meant in one sentence. What would it be? Ethan paused, smiled, and said, "Justice doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone willing to sit beside the unheard until the world is quiet enough to listen." Then he walked away, no entourage, no camera crew. Just a warm hand on his daughter's shoulder and the simple piece of a job no longer his to finish. That's how it ends. Not with vengeance, not with viral moments, but with a girl who once cried in 3A now teaching the world to see differently. Because in the end, the story of Ethan and Sienna Blake wasn't about a flight. It was about altitude, not just how far you rise, but who you lift as you go. In a world that often feels loud and divided, the story of Ethan and Sienna Blake reminds us that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. It can begin with stillness, with the quiet strength of a father protecting his child from being made invisible. The deeper message isn't just about calling out discrimination, it's about choosing decency when it's easier to look away. For older generations who have witnessed decades of change, this story affirms a timeless truth: dignity isn't given by status or title. It's upheld by action, often when no one is watching. It reminds us that we all, no matter our age, still carry the power to shape a kinder world. Whether it's speaking up, extending a hand, or simply refusing to stay silent, our choices can create lasting ripples. And perhaps the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't what we build, but how we helped others feel seen, valued, and safe. As we grow older, our example becomes a torch lighting the path not with pride, but with purpose. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's shoes? Would you have stayed calm? Would you have spoken up for your child? Ethan didn't ask for attention. He stood for something greater: dignity, compassion, and doing the right thing, even when no one else did. But now that the dust has settled, what should he do next? Should he continue leading quietly from the background, or step back into the spotlight and guide the next generation even more directly? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What advice would you give Ethan as a father, a leader, and a man who changed so many lives without raising his voice? And if this story moved you, if you believe in what Ethan and Sienna stood for, drop a number 1 in the comments to show your support. Let's remind the world that kindness done right still matters.